Yeah. So I'm Dean Razavi. I'm 33 years old. I'm based in New York City. And I came to games in a little bit of a different way. So I don't have any of that experience in AAA or working even for like a mid-sized studio. I was an attorney for quite a while as a practicing litigator. And after about 6 or 7 years doing that, I opened my own indie game studio. In addition, just this past year, I've started working with other indies to specifically handle production with a focus on console production issues, but just generally games production, project management, business relationships, and things like that. And ultimately ended up here through I don't really know how I ended up making the shift from attorney to game, but ended up here because it was something that I was always just doing as a hobby, and it eventually just grew into something that I wasn't really able to manage, putting out games that I had promised, to people on Kickstarter alongside the same path as,
right.
Working as an attorney and stuff like that. So it ultimately boiled down into that,
Gotcha. Well, I don't know why we do the things we do. I'm not going to hold you. And I know I'm speaking to an attorney here, so you may, whatever, lame attorney joke or lame attorney stereotype. So
they're all true, but
yeah, no, I know. So I feel like, as the years have gone on and I've done this project, it's been about 5 years now somehow. Questions have gotten more existential. My scope has expanded. I talk to tons of people outside of the game field. But really at the heart of it, it's just trying to understand modern crises, the rest of our world through whatever is going on in the video game field, video game industry, culture, whatever you want to call it. So I haven't done an interview like this in a while with just a person who found themselves making games, didn't set out to make that their career goal. Because I feel we use this catch-all term indie, or we cloud it in all this other weird language, and I think we forget that yeah, you may belong to a certain peer group or professional group, but you're still an individual trying to figure out and make your way. And so this is kind of an odd first question, but something I have always heard, and because I haven't done an interview like this in a while, I'm wondering if people are still like this. When you talk to friends or you talk to family about what you do for a living, do they think that making games means you're just playing games in your sweatpants all day? Are there still disconnects where you feel those closest to you still don't understand the lifestyle and what it means? Or do you have extremely well-adjusted and open-minded everyone in your life and they totally get you?
I really want to be the person who has that.
Yeah, me too.
So I have a weird bucket with it. I still to this day catch myself in moments where if I'm meeting somebody new for the first time and they ask, "So what do you do?" I have caught myself caveating that with, "Well, now I actually make video games, but before I was a lawyer." And it's not in terms of trying to, here in an interview, it's to explain the path that led me here. But in most situations, I have found it's for that very reason that you called out, which is people are going to assume that I'm a lazy jerk who's just sitting at home playing video games all day. And I want to be able to show off first, no, I promise I'm smart, and I promise that I actually put in the work. I've had several actual indie developer friends call me out on this when they've seen it. And they're like, "Why the hell are you caveating this shit?" And I think it's a very fair thing. So there's a sense of embarrassment isn't quite the right word, but it's close. That comes with it still.
But I think
I'm trying to work on that.
I don't know that it's embarrassment. Like I know, so as I think you know, I'm a writer. Although this website is not my writing. I think there's a desire, because I'm in that boat myself. There's a desire when people ask you that question, you want to get past that. Depends on who you are, your personality type. But I'm the personality type that's like, I want to get that part of the conversation over as quickly as possible so that I'm not doing a lot of explaining and that people aren't asking me for gossip or people aren't asking me, because, they'll ask me like, oh, well, they ask me stuff where like I think it's clear that like, oh, well, they think that I can either make them famous or they think that like I can make, their script idea become a TV show.
Right.
And so I feel like
none of this is going to happen for you.
Well, it's not so much that. It's more like, gosh, man, we're all trying to figure it out. Like, I feel like it's not necessarily all a place of embarrassment if you're trying to simplify or, like, get yourself out of, running conversation simulation subset 4 or 5B, where you explain that, like, making video games is a job, and you explain that it's work, and then you explain it's actually hard work. Especially if, like, you're just like meeting someone for the first time and you may never talk to them again.
Right.
That's my assumption on do you feel like it's coming from a place of insecurity, or is it partially that as well?
I think it's a little bit of both. Sure. I think that it definitely, and to put a direct answer to your question, of whether or not like people who are close in my life kind of understand it. They definitely do. Even at this point with family and parents, even if my parents don't necessarily understand the ins and outs, they get that it's hard work. They see what I'm doing. They're proud of the games that I'm putting out. And so that has helped significantly. But I do still think that there's a little bit of that. I mean, not to be yet another stereotype, but I am Jewish. And, growing up in that kind of environment where there is that, kind of that natural Jewish mother guilt of expectations. And having, having been an attorney is a much more prestigious thing in that kind of mindset. And so to be able to have said, this is what I was doing and all that kind of stuff, was still something that I was just conscious about. And also, I think that ties hand in hand with what everyone will talk about, which is imposter syndrome. It's a both thing where I am simultaneously like, am I really a good developer / designer? And I used to have something that a lot more people can fully grasp as being something noteworthy or exciting or something like that.
Yeah, on paper, it must seem... I haven't actually looked at your LinkedIn or whatever, but, like, I don't know. I mean, it's like people have this expectation for... outside of, like, your racial background or your religious background or your family background. Like, people are like, oh, well, that's a bit of a sharp turn that you made there. And I think, like, for video games in general, like, that has been a thing that's plagued it from early on. I mean, maybe for as long as I know and for as long as I've researched into, that seems to be a thing where it's like, well, I guess because it's centered around fun, it seems like, well, how could that have, how could that matter, I think is like what people are saying.
Yeah.
Although it's certainly unstable too, but I don't think people who make those judgments know about like discoverability. You know what I mean? That's just my gut feeling on it.
Yes.
But I do wonder too, because I feel like I always describe it as like we're across the aisle, like developers are on one side, media is on the other. And so imposter syndrome aside about like, how do we feel in our respective camps? Like I often wonder like that does happen sometimes where like people go from writer to developer. It's rare, but it happens. So I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect there where a lot of people on my side just don't have a faintest clue about what people on your side's like day to day is like, or like the way that our coverage impacts those perceptions, or even indeed like helps you feel comfortable pursuing certain creative instincts. And so, I mean, I'm not at all asking, I never ask with these kind of questions like, oh, let's talk about specific sites or specific writers. Like, I'm just curious in general, like, are there, like what's something you wish media or media people on social media, like what do you wish they just understood better about what life is like for you guys?
That's a tough one. I go back and forth on these kinds of issues because I'm also beyond somebody who, like you said, is on the other side of the aisle and needs that kind of symbiotic relationship with, particularly with games media. Yeah. I'm also a consumer of it. And that's kind of separate from my dev and design and game side. It's just like I'm interested in reading it myself. And so, to put on my like indie hat and be like, yeah, I really want media to be able to cover like the passion that goes into these small projects and to be able to shine a light on, these hidden gems and things like that, because there's AAA games that get like a million different articles, all this kind of stuff. But then, like, as a consumer hat, like putting on my consumer hat, I'm like, I don't want to read about like every single indie game. I'm gonna be honest,
Right.
And so I think it's a balance there. I do think that I know that we didn't want to call out like any specific writers or anything like that. I do appreciate that some places have been doing more.
We can. No. We can. It's I never want people to feel like. I never want people to feel like, oh, good, we're gonna dish on whoever. I'm much more interested in like, well, what are the systems in place rather than the individuals? Because I don't think, even if they have a huge amount of followers or readers or whatever, they're still a product of the systems. I'm much more interested in like laying to bear, or like just getting others to acknowledge or talk about with me. But you absolutely can if you want to.
No. I just mean it more in terms of like larger places are doing more long form essays or on the other side, like investigative journalism. And as a consumer, I really enjoy reading that as opposed to any kind of specific like game critiques or things, in part because I do feel like, different games for different people. I very much embraced that also in the past few years. I'm like, I've managed to get myself to a place where I'm like, obviously my games aren't for everyone. No game is for everyone. That's fine. So I'm not really sure that games media, when it comes to just reviews, previews, articles about particular games, are helpful or are meaningful for me, at least, because one person's opinion is kind of irrelevant to my general practices. Whereas media that's covering more of the industry, like Dive, like some other places are, I think, just generally more interesting reads. In terms of actual like coverage of games, I think on social media, you've also mentioned, and like being able to kind of refer to those moments. I still don't know what that real relationship is. I mean, for like, not to poo-poo the press or anything like that as a large, massive entity, but most developers, I think, would tell you that even significant mentions in large readership publications aren't going to see any kind of meaningful impact on your sales, right?
Yeah. Or like, there's one developer I know who is a huge name in those developer circles. Like, I remember he emailed me about like something he tweeted once where it was like, gosh, I don't know, like 20K retweets or something. It was like one of those things where people would assume like, oh, well, a lot of people saw that and it was like, oh, well, like no one actually clicked through onto what the link was.
Yeah.
Which is a thing, which is definitely a thing. And I think, I don't know, like I honestly don't know, because I feel like this is like what a lot of people's, bag on, or whatever, just like their sort of grudge against, it's just like, it's so counterproductive, because like, it's talked about in a way where I think people assume like everyone who writes about games, like we're all hanging out in the same break room and we talk about our story ideas over the water cooler. And I think people think of developers like that too. It's like there is no, like I remember for a long time, like just the word indie, which I find now I'm like, whatever, I'll use it. Like I don't know if that's really, there just seems to be like a lot of divisiveness, and I don't know if that's still the case, because I feel like you stop hearing about some kinds of divisiveness, you feel like it goes away. But there's also like among writers, like there's like divisiveness over like, well, that tweet didn't deserve 20,000 retweets. But it's over these things where it's like, it's just like a number on a site, and it doesn't actually, for your guys, like it doesn't necessarily like transfer into like money, like it doesn't actually help support you. It's like some weird popularity.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah. Most of the time this stuff is totally meaningless. And, generates its own buzz for its own buzz's sake.
Right.
But, much like, developers will tell you that going to conventions, for example, by and large, they're not going to see a bump in their sales or anything like that. It's just kind of the name of the game. And so it's difficult for me to say, oh, yes, well, this then should be the standard for the relationship with the press, because I think the press should cover what the press wants to cover.
Well, that's an interesting, yeah, go ahead. That leads into an interesting question that I wanted to ask, but please continue.
Yeah, no, I think that it's something that if the press is writing articles about games or stories or insight, like industry insights, or just about their own personal relationship with games, or whatever that is that's interesting to them, that's inherently more of an interesting read. And that's kind of where I think that should go, as opposed to a situation where press is serving in some way to try to promote the game, and then developers are trying to angle to get that best press coverage. And don't get me wrong, I'm going to get off the phone and I'm going to do exactly that, right? Like that's still my job, is to try to be able to get that press coverage. But it's not. It's more formulaic, and I guess it's because it's what we've always done, then it is necessarily definitionally helpful.
Right. I mean, I think we as humans, you probably have more insight into this as an attorney. We like buckets of thought, and we want to be able to ascribe, like we want to make sense of our world, because we want to get back to not thinking about stuff, which I'm not saying is like a snooty fan of the TV show Frasier. I mean, it is like we want to exert as little effort as we have to in our day-to-day, because our day-to-day is stressful and our lives are chaotic, and we want to be chill where we can be chill. And so, I mean, like there is a lot of that in the video game world of like, you'll see post-mortems, at GDC. Like people want to try to make sense of the work they did and why the result is what the result was. And so, like, I know for a lot of developers, they feel like there's sort of been like they've been locked in this pattern for the last decade where there's just a lot of like, it's very homogeneous, like in the indie community or whatever you want to call it, where it, like it's like how many games are coming out that are platformers. Is like a question I've heard from, I can't tell you how many indie developers in these interviews through the years, but so that's a thing that I've heard people talk about, and they feel like that is starting to thaw a bit, that it's no longer like people are not going to like stab you if you say among other developers that like, boy, it feels like we're being kind of real risk averse here. Because I always wanted to ask people like, Like, does it feel like people are making the games they want to make? And I know that there's economic risk. There's all these other things wrapped up in it. It's not a purely creative endeavor for some people, and it can't be. But the other side of that is true too. I wonder what your feeling is about the press. Like, does it feel like the press is covering what it actually wants to cover? That's actually, to me, a more interesting question.
Yeah. There's a lot baked into that.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I'm probably the wrong person to ask as to whether or not the press is covering what they want to be able to cover.
Sure.
In part because, it's like we can just go and ask them, right? But I will say that from the perspective of indies in general, or like game developers in general, becoming more risk averse. I mean, the story of larger studios being risk averse is well traveled ground is what I'm looking for.
Right.
And I think it's just the natural progression of, when you're worried about this putting bread on the table, you need to not necessarily, you need to be able to both believe in your game and have some sense that your game is going to sell. Unfortunately, I think that's how that expresses itself, is in finding yourself kind of looking more at market research or trying to understand what the next trends are going to be or things like that.
Yeah.
Indies certainly still have the availability to do more cool things, and that's, an old story. But even now, as like kind of the fallout, the post-indie apocalypse era, as it's not a situation where anybody is just like getting on, making their game and leaving, and instead are trying to formalize those remains into businesses that have some amount of longevity. They're going to have to fall in the same traps, as any other studio.
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit, I didn't do any, like when I started this, I just was like, well, I have questions and I can't seem to get traction pitching the kinds of, I can't seem to get traction pitching pieces centered around the questions I have. Like the climate was, and I think it continues to be, we just want to give people answers, and I think there's a value to that, but I did no market research. Like I feel like, but I'm just one person, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression was, based on last time we met, was like, other than a composer, like you largely do a lot of the work yourself, or all the work yourself. This was a couple of years ago, though. So is that right?
Yeah, I've fortunately brought on a few additional contractors and individual. I still don't have any employees. For my own game, the team is now at like 6 people, I want to say.
Okay.
Which is nice. Yeah, it's definitely easier to find more breathing room in that. It also means managing more people, of course, which is, starts to take up more and more of your time. And on some of my other projects, because I had mentioned that I produce for other studios as well, those can be, like 6 to 10 person teams as well. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I wanted to bridge to kind of like business advice conversations, and I think you used the word hate in our emails, which is like you hate this sort of like checklist mentality to success.
Yeah.
So like what feels weird about that? What feels off about that? What feels disingenuous about that? What do you hate about that?
What do I hate? It's like, and it goes back to exactly what you were talking about, of trying to make sense of what happens, in a post-mortem or something like that at GDC, where, individuals say, like, look at a game's failure and, genuinely try to ask for advice or something like that, because we feel like we're in a place where, I thought I did everything right. What went wrong?
Yeah.
And And then there's just kind of a regurgitation of the same old things, right? Well, you weren't active on social media enough. Well, you weren't, did you post here? Did you put, and inevitably somebody will find a situation well, you didn't post on this particular forum, or you didn't, your trailer video takes like a full 45 seconds to get to gameplay and it really should be 30, or it's tougher, all that, you have too much or too little or however much text on your Steam page, or you have, and it always ends up boiling down to stupid things that don't matter like that, without an understanding that you can make a good game, you can do everything right, you can still fail. And that's a conversation that we're not having, in the indie space at all. That it is possible to have done everything correctly and fail, and there are games that have been tremendous successes that didn't do everything on your checklist and everything by the book. And by enforcing this checklist mentality, what you're doing is you're placing the blame for a failure on the developer and designer or the marketer or whoever, but on that studio and on the people who made that game and participate in the creation of that game. And you're not kind of taking a step back and saying, maybe there's not blame. Maybe this is just a tough market. Maybe this is a difficult industry to gain traction in. And this just wasn't the right time for this game or it was, but the world and karma at large have decided that this is not going to happen for you. This checklist mentality creates such a blame game that I think it's very toxic.
Yeah, I mean, again, talking across the aisles, I mean, I don't know. I always like going to GDC, or I did much earlier in my time with this stuff, because I think at that time, outside of a forum or two online, there really was no way to hear the conversations developers have when they think it's only them in the room, and it's just interesting to hear them talk about their work in their way. I mean, whatever, GDC is sort of a side issue, and as that show has kind of changed, and what it's sort of evolved to become. But I always found it interesting that in those post-mortems, you almost never hear people talk about things like opportunity cost, or ways they could have spent time even working on other projects. Like a lot of them, this is my words, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree. A lot of them often feel like those postmortems can sound just commercials for either the game or their company, and why you should come work for them. That's my impression. I don't know if that's your feeling or if you've been to a lot of things like that.
I do think that I don't want to poo-poo postmortems
No, but I think that's sort of
extremely helpful.
That somehow has become the accepted template for, I don't know, and a good friend of mine, he had a really popular GDC talk, and it was I think it was refreshing, because it was oh, here's every way we killed ourselves and did everything the wrong, stupid way, which I think people, reacted positively to, because they're yeah, I didn't think it would be 15-second difference in my video would really, be the determining factor in whether I could support myself or not from this game. There's more to it than that,
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that there is more to it than that.
Yeah.
That people who are looking at these kinds of things and trying to tease apart a lot of these small issues, by and large miss the bigger picture and don't really have a strong sense. They're just looking. It's somebody who comes out and says, and this is a two-parter, right? Like you said, these postmortems or talks about successes and failures often end up as a commercial. I think actually the last time you and I had talked, we had discussed a game that had by and large been a commercial failure that was gaining traction press at least by advertising the fact that it was a failure. Or had been so far, that they had put in, years and years of effort into it, and more or less nothing had come out.
Yeah.
It's using failure in that way as a commercial, and the developers are actually really asking for advice. They're saying, my game failed. I don't understand why. I need somebody to sympathize with me, and that's fair. That all of us are looking for that in a lot of ways. When something goes wrong, it's I don't need your advice on how to fix this. I just need you to tell me this sucks, right? And so that's what developers are often looking for in those moments. And then for particularly for such a critical community, I mean, you have talked more at length about the blessings and curses of those who play games, and the audience that we're catering to at this point. But for that particular audience, it's very easy for them to fall into that pattern of, let me find what you could have fixed, right? And let me just pick some things out here. And some of that's helpful, and some of it's not. Most of it isn't. And I still worry about the perception that simply because you weren't, there were a few weeks that you didn't tweet, that now that's something that the game developer now thinks is the cause of their failure, which it isn't. There's just no way that that's the case. Right. And also that other people are now able to blame you for it. Oh, well, that's your own fault. It's,
right.
That's why I tend to avoid those kinds of business marketing 101 for indies kind of things, because they all hand wave away the fact that there is an X factor, there's a secret sauce that literally nobody knows what it is, including tremendously successful marketers, and everyone's just going to pretend that doesn't exist. And by pretending that doesn't exist, it creates a negative environment.
I think it's hard to put on a slide in a deck a caveat that's just, oh, by the way, the universe is an unpredictable and occasionally, or maybe often, cruel place, and none of this may apply. Good luck.
Yeah. If the story is couched in those languages, I'm way more on board, right?
But what I thought you were going to mention was, when you and I met up in Texas, however many years ago, I know how long ago that feels like. It feels like it was 50 years ago now to me. It was at South by Southwest. I was down there doing a panel either later that day or later that week. And I think for you, was it the morning of or just before sort of one of these kind of behind closed doors events that gives feedback? I don't know what you can talk about or what you can't, and I'm not trying to get you to talk about a thing you can't.
I can actually talk about the whole thing. No, I can talk about the whole thing. It was
but it was an advice thing, right?
Kind of. It was a competition.
Yeah.
It was a competition where you were provided feedback. Yeah. And it was broken into 2 rounds. So this was for my last game, which was in a weird place because I was pitching a game that was already out in early access. So this wasn't, all the other games were somewhere between prototype and vertical slice. And I was the only one who was let me show you sales figures so far, right? Because I had that information.
Yeah.
So this was a pitch competition. There were I can't even remember how many games were invited originally after a paper application. And then we met each with a mentor that would kind of walk you through your slides and your deck. And then you would there was a first round of presentations. That was all behind closed doors. And we got feedback from the judges. And then some cut was made. And then a second round of us advanced to a finals. And those finals were actually open to the public. So anybody at South by Southwest could attend that. And this is kind of also why I'm much more of a person who believes in that there are stuff that you can do, but most of your successes will be pure luck. In the final round of the competition, Kelly Wallach, who is the CEO of Indie Megabooth, was one of the judges. And so I gave my presentation and did not win in the final round or anything like that. But Kelly had pulled me aside afterwards, and she was like, I have seen the application for Vidar for Indie Megabooth come across my desk several times. I had no idea what this game was, because the way that you are presenting it in the written application to us is not conveying all those cool things that you told me about on stage. So let's talk about ways that you can do that, right? And I took all of that advice. I reapplied for Megabooth. This was after I had launched the game, and got in after like 6 rejections from Megabooth. Whether that's because, I took her advice, or whether that's because she now recognized the game, I don't know. But I do know that I would not have gotten in had I not had the opportunity to talk with her, right? So whether or not the feedback in terms of the actual presentation at South by was of any help, whether meeting, those edits that my mentor gave me to a pitch deck for a game that has been released and I'm no longer working on, was of any help. The event itself ended up being beneficial in ways that I would have never been able to tell you in advance, even that morning, because I'm now like part of the Megabooth family. The game that I'm working on right now was part of Megabooth this past PAX East, and that for me was a personal goal to be able to get in there. And so it's not to say that there's that the universe is random and just do nothing, and whether you succeed or not is not up to you, because my moral of the story there is more or less, if you need to be in the right place at the right time, then just be everywhere all the time. But there's more to it. I mean, it's right place at the right time, but also right attitude, right mindset. Probably also right breakfast also. yes, all of it. And so I think that event ultimately, it's interesting that you and I had met that morning, because I credit that event for a lot of additional stuff that fell into place for me, because I will tell you, we talked a little bit about behind closed doors. The Indie Megabooth has a secret alumni listserv, which is just a listserv for anyone who has shown a game there. And having access to that for me, like being able to just email people who I respect and admire in this space, seeing the other questions that other people have, where I'm like, shit, I didn't even think about that. All those that has been the most invaluable resource that I've had in a very long time.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about that. I mean, I think that's true for all fields and careers. I think you brush aside the myopia people have about video games, even in the space, like the kinds of things they don't want to think about. I think it connects with some of the stuff we were saying at the outset, where it's like people want to know, okay, well, what do you do? And then they also want to know, like, well, how'd you get there? And I think about with me and my career and where I'm heading and the uncertainties and the aspirations, and I'm just like everyone else. Like I think about it though, and it's like, but this has been such a bizarre, zigzagging, unexpected, this butterfly effect. It's like, and I find I'm a couple of years older than you, and like I find that like the longer you keep pushing and you keep doing stuff, the more stuff from your past where you're like, well, why did I do this 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Like I find in the last 5 years, there's been a lot more of that, like, oh, okay. I mean, that hasn't come through yet, but it's like, oh, I understand this about me now, or I understand this about like where I'm headed. And so I feel like those are really hard to boil down in a post-mortem of like the more kind of cosmic, ethereal drive that we all have, like what's actually behind why you're doing what you're doing. So I think it's interesting, and I think it's pretty astute to observe, like, yeah, I don't know if I got in because she met me, and so I was a person to her, or I guess probably is a mix, right? It's not all it's not either of those things, but I mean, you did go to Texas, and it's like every attempt you keep making to try to get traction leads to traction. Even if it's not in the thing you're trying to do, it leads you there sooner or later. I don't know why it is about the video game space where, like, you can't put that on one of those, like, crowdsourced spreadsheets about, like, well, how's indie doing? I don't know why that's I don't know if that's a thing that, like, you all email about on those secret email groups, though. Are these conversations you have with other developers routinely, or is it much more goal-oriented, milestone metrics, KPI stuff?
I would say they're somewhere in between. They're definitely more goal-oriented.
Yeah.
I would say that at least for that kind of community, those kinds of numbers are very much like a mobile like concept that super doesn't apply to kind of the stuff that I do, right? We can be looking at things like sales. We can be looking at Steam wish lists and all those things. It's kind of rare, although it is nice every so often for one person to be kind of like the test game. So, whether that was Discord launching their own store, or people were participating in like humble bundles or anything like that, or people now in the Apple Arcade, somebody can go out and be like, we're doing it. We'll report back in a month to let you know if it's worth it. and that's a very helpful thing to have, because otherwise, without some place for us to be able to talk, we have no idea whether or not these things are quote unquote worth it, whatever that means. So
how do you figure out? Yeah, I was just gonna say, how do you figure out like what is good advice and what isn't? I mean, do you even believe in advice?
Yeah, I definitely do. I tend to look for me personally, and this is just like a general rule well beyond games or anything like that, is I'm looking for something that when I hear it, I'm like, I kind of knew that deep down inside, but I never thought about it or expressed it in those terms, and it's now like resonating in a very interesting way. That tends to be my like expectation, I guess, for this stuff. I also just look at, who's providing it and what their experience is. And I think that that's super important as well, right? If somebody's giving you advice and on a particular subject, you kind of need to know where they're coming from and what their perspective is on it.
What about
for these conversations? Yeah.
Yeah, no, you go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, for these kinds of conversations, it tends to be like I need to do some research to understand whether or not that's advice that I want to act on. And by and large, if somebody comes back and reports and says like, oh, this wasn't worth it for us, or we found that by doing X, Y, and Z, we got more wish lists on our Steam page, or whatever that is. It's something that gets flagged in my mind, and then it's something that I'm going to go back and do a lot more research on. I'm not just going to take the advice and run with it. But it gives me a starting point. And again, as somebody who still considers himself kind of newish to all of this, starting points are really helpful for me.
Yeah. I was just going to ask because people always ask me this now, and I understand why, and I know. I think closer to the time we met, I mean, there were a couple of stories. Maybe it was just one, and in my head, I'm thinking of more than one. There were a couple stories written about you, like, quote unquote, meet the lawyer who started making games or something, which is an angle that, like, I get why people get, but, like, I guess I'm just curious, like, like that as a hook. Like, I'm curious what you make of that, and whether you felt like, was that an actual, like, was that a disingenuous interest that people had? Like how much they actually talked about the work that you're doing? Because I feel like the conventional wisdom used to be pitch writers, pitch sites, your story. Like, what is it that makes you unique? And I can remember, because this is sort of another overlap we have as, like, a classroom experience and trying to teach. about being in the game space, like that was like 2012, I think, when I was doing those classes with a friend of mine, and it's like the rules have changed so much since then, and I get so many people popping up in my inbox being like, how do I get Kotaku to write about me? How do I get whatever? And then I in equal measure, get writers. How do I get in at Kotaku to write? and I feel like, I don't know, because it's all happening in the greater context of like media super struggling, budget not doing super great. Kotaku, for example, I know there's like a bunch of rumblings and shakeups happening this week with some of their union and stuff. Not all that is public knowledge yet, but I have some sense of what's going on. I don't even fully know.
I saw a lot of the tweets yesterday, like trying to make sense of something happening going on.
I feel like, I would say this because I do this. Twitter is not the place to go to make sense of things.
Right.
But I mean, like, what do you make of like that whole, like, the way you had been framed in the past? Like, does that impact the work you're trying to do? Does it solidify your reputation? Like, what do you tell people when they're like, how do I get places to write about me?
Yeah. As we kind of discussed earlier, my general response to that question is it doesn't matter. Don't try, I guess. Like,
yeah, that's interesting, because that's what I do, is just like, well, it'll come in time, be open to it, maybe you make inquiries, but it's like, I feel like as one person doing this thing, it's like, I could either work on the site or I could do all this other stuff in service of the site, and then there's like no time. Then there's no time for the site anymore.
Right. Yeah. No, that's also. That's a huge like question that I'm constantly coming across, which is like, at what point do I just sit down and make the damn game? Which I personally, for me, is the opposite problem that I think a lot of devs have, because a lot of designer dev people come to games from a programming background, and so they're like in a position where they're more comfortable just sitting down and making the game, and then when they're forced into these situations, they're like, fine, all right, I guess I'll actually try to get some work done, but marketing stuff. But in terms of how it's been framed, I'm hoping to be able to move away from that story. It doesn't bother me so much because it is a part of who I am. I think it's inherently a part of my approach and my perspective to making games, and is going to, whether I know it or not, be baked into whatever I make. And so I don't mind like people knowing my story. It is my story.
Yeah.
But it is an interesting, weird shift to then be able to say like, okay, but no, I know what I'm doing in this design space. I know what I'm doing from a technical space. I think that's been the most surprising for people and difficult for me to get over.
Yeah.
When I'm serving in a production capacity now, and I make a technical recommendation about like using this particular service or changing how this is going to go or whatever, there is still like that tinge of like, okay, but you're not the developer in the room, and you're also like you're clearly coming from a biz perspective because you're a lawyer, and that's not where I'm at right now.
I mean, so. I don't think writers realize that like those stories, like once they're told the first time, they can follow a developer around for a while. I mean, there's this story I wrote in 2014 with this developer I met at GDC, and like every time I go to GDC, I seem to make one new friend for life. So like I really should get my butt over there. It's just I've spent too many years going over there year to year, and it's harder to get assignments that justify it. But like I wrote a story about this guy that I met, and we met just quite randomly at GDC. Like he lives in the town where like the rest of my family went to college. Like we have all these things in common, and we had a great night just meeting randomly, talking, and we never once talked about like he never once mentioned, oh, I'm a developer and you should check out my game, and I never said, oh, I'm a writer. Like we weren't wearing our badges. Like he couldn't even afford a badge. Like he just went out there I found out afterwards because he's like, hey, oh, by the way, after we had been talking for a while, he's like, oh, I have a game here. I said, oh, well, I'm a writer. And he's like, all right, we should just meet up tomorrow. Maybe I can show you it in my backpack. And I said, okay. And so I wrote a thing about him and was like, I felt bad in hindsight because I think it has like cast this thing on their image where it's like perpetually, they're like these scrappy ragamuffins.
Scrappy indie.
Yeah. And it's like, they've learned to like embrace that, and they're always like, oh, they feel like, I was the first one to sort of give them a shot, and I got the ball rolling because it gave them credibility and it gave them a clip they could use. But it really made me pause and I was like, gosh, I really feel bad about like, if I had known, I would have been a little bit more deliberate in like not just describing things literally the way they were, but also like recognizing like, yeah, like you're a human and you have other goals. And I don't think it was insulting or anything in any sort, but I honestly think like, because so much of this is through the internet, we just don't think about the way that these different groups can sort of affect each other, and even their viability as professionals. But I don't know, like I think about that in connection with oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I try to take a more optimistic view on that, and look at that as saying like, you can go back and look at like, oh, how far you've come, right? I think there's benefit to that. I think that there is kind of in the same vein as what you were talking about with looking back at the steps that have led you to your career path, the steps that have led me to mine.
Right.
And trying to make some kind of cosmic sense out of it and reconciling those events, like post hoc. I think that having media like almost serve as like chronicling function and track that journey a little bit there's benefit to it. And that perspective might be difficult, or that kind of, you're these scrappy indies who are just kind of doing your thing. Or for me, like you're the lawyer, right? And that's like your quirk. You're the lawyer, right? And it's still like, listen, it still happens. Like I still have plenty of people who are like, oh, you're the like lawyer. Let me ask you about this weird, like, can you look at can you review the contract that I'm thinking of signing with my artist? And I'm like, no, one, because like I'm not practicing anymore, and two, because I was never that kind of lawyer. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do that while I was practicing, right? But those stories can follow you around, but they do go away as long as you're continuing to make news stories.
That's
right?
True. That's true.
So I think that has to be the work.
That's true. Well, maybe this will be one of the last things I was going to ask you is, I hate to paint you as, to quote from our emails and to just quote, you're grumpy about this or you hated that, I think would similarly mischaracterize you. But hopefully, people hearing your voice and stuff, they'll understand you're not some sort of angry grump. But we were talking about like meta groups that have sprung up around the industry trying to help people navigate it. And you said that these just kind of rub you the wrong way. I don't know if we already covered that. I mean, it just sounds like, I wonder if what we're connecting this all to is like, you can't quantify success in this space. But there are definitely like some bad operators who are trying to simplify it or trying to make it seem like, well, hire us and you'll be fine. Which I guess is a learning lesson in itself and is valuable. But when you're shot out the other side of it, like you still have to figure things out for yourself. And I think that's the thing. People don't want to hear that.
Yeah, they don't. They want to know that there's like a checklist for the next time too.
Right.
I also think that in general, this for me is also kind of a, this is, instead of indie apocalypse, this is now like indie support network apocalypse. Like this is, if we can't be in the game space, right? There's still a lot of people who play games who want to make games. And listen, I absolutely will and should be accused of being that person myself, right? But those people now who can't just get into the game space because we've seen like, oh, this is way harder than it is, would rather just try to build something that is games adjacent or is near that. So, I mean, I can't tell you like how many emails a week I get for somebody releasing like their new Steam competitor. And it's like, come on guys, like this isn't where this is going. This isn't where the market is going. This isn't where the industry is. And I don't want to now have to like field all of these kinds of situations. It's not something that I like am like, oh, these people shouldn't be doing this. But it's just like every time I see that email, it makes me a little grumpy. Like, yeah. or you know, we're starting like yet another networking event for indies to meet other indies. I'm like, I know all the indies. I already know all of them. You know, hey, we all get drinks every week. It's fine. Like, yeah. It's gonna be the same people over and over. So those kinds of things, it just strikes me as the next thing to go. The support for like these groups that try to pop up, sometimes charge, but in all events are trying to now use your studio to promote their own, not actually in the game space, but in the game space thing. So, yeah.
I mean, I can only speak for myself. As someone who is ostensibly trying to be an adult, like that dynamic is much more apparent, probably more through just my, my time as a freelancer, my time as a small raft in very large choppy waters. And I feel like, as a lawyer, like you could see that much more quickly, that kind of thing. If you're younger, if you're just getting started out, you would think, oh, well, these are experts and they're there to help me. And, people are basically good and they're not going to try to take advantage of me. But I think, in a weird, indirect way, hopefully they're not too expensive. It's still a valuable lesson.
Right.
So there's no real good way to segue into this, which is like the thing I ask everyone to close each conversation out. What do you think video games have accomplished?
I look at this from more of a okay. I'm going to rewind a second. There's a lot of different ways that could go, but I'm actually just going to answer it personally. I think because video games accomplish a lot for me and my husband, just like on a individual one-to-one level.
Yeah.
There's we game a lot. We play video games practically every night together. And it doesn't even have to be like something where we're both playing together. A lot of times it's like one of us playing a single player game and the other on a couch just watching. And so for me, broadly speaking, video games have created and empowered and enriched my relationship personally with my husband. And I think that for me is enough. I don't think that you need to do anything more in a very selfish way. Because that's our time together. That's our way of interacting with each other is through a medium of storytelling, challenge, interest, right? Because sometimes it's just us, oh, I want to see what happens next. Sometimes it's, oh, I'm stuck on this puzzle, or something like that. And all of those, I think, just create a medium through which we are able to have a relationship in that way. And I really like that.
Cool.
Yeah, that's kind of where I want to leave it. We could talk about like societal implications, but I don't really care about them.